So it has been established that the location where the Straw Hats have found themselves in was in fact not the true elbaf, but it was an illusion this entire time, just like predicted, created with a bunch of mirrors and this giant diorama, a giant toy playset. And again, another big win with the correct prediction that the giants that were watching the commotion from afar are in fact not giants and instead just regular humans, and it was also a giant who was behind all of this, who created this, and he is known as the sun god. So far so good. Everything is going according to the predictions set from the previous chapter, and the last major point concerns the identity of this giant that is now chasing the Straw Hats as they try to make their escape. All in all, this chapter is a huge bit of satisfaction because pretty much everything that's been theorized has come to pass, and since that is the case, I have my own ideas of where this arc will lead and what the next section of the arc will cover, where it will be, and so on. However, one thing that I'm really struggling with here is that this giant with the deer skull, I am on the fence about whether this is Prince Loki. So with that, this false sun god giant, or potentially, possibly, unofficially Loki, regardless of whether this giant is actually the Prince of the Giants or not, the character of Loki is not going to be just a one-to-one reimagining of the figure from the mythos or from popular culture. I'm only saying popular culture because there's a good chunk of people who, when they hear the name Loki, they think of Tom Hiddleston and the MCU rather than Norse mythology. Maybe some people even think of Atreus from the God of War franchise, but what I'm saying is that it would simply just be boring to have a simple rehash of an already established infamous figure. And just like those other iterations I mentioned, this one in One Piece will be unique and special in its own right. But all of that should go without saying, to be honest. Just like with the rest of the story that has taken inspiration from real life history, they've been given their own twist to make them different in their characterization or culture. Take Dressrosa and its heavy inspiration from Spain. I don't think Spain has living toys running about the streets. So Loki will have characteristics that are unique to this version of him that may be simple gags, like Zoro getting lost or having no sense of direction, or Brook's skull jokes, or Chopper not being able to take a compliment, or these characteristics may be something much more vital to his character and the story. And those features of Loki will build upon the foundations of his character, which will be the aspects Oda will have taken inspiration from to create him in the first place, such as Loki from Norse mythology. And as for why I think this deer skull sun god giant could still be him rather than a new character is because of another possible point of reference I have stumbled upon. Something else Oda may have taken inspiration from for this character. There may even be more points of inspiration as we get to know Loki, but for this one, it is, apologies for mispronunciation, is the figure of Kanunos from Celtic mythology. The biggest link between this giant who is chasing everyone and Kanunos is the deer skull or the antlers that are on top of their heads. One thing I want to mention is that another theory I've seen is that this giant is the same as this member of the Holy Knights that we see behind Garland in the God Valley part of Kuma's backstory. And if that turns out to be true, that would be really cool. That in its own right, having a Holy Knights member on Elbaf would be crazy. A question I do have though is that the Giants and the world government don't really mix, so I don't know why a giant would be on the Holy Knights, that high up of a position in the world government. But yeah, that's a really good idea, but I'm going to have a bit more fun with it. Before this chapter, I had no idea of the existence of Kanunos as a mythological figure, so I didn't make the connection straight away with the deer skull and antlers. In my limited research, first I came across the Wendigo, but I disregarded it since it's from Native American folklore, which I don't think will have relevance on Elbaf. Then I looked into whether the deer skull has any significance in Nordic culture, and that's when I stumbled upon Kanunos. So that's a single thing, the deer skull, it's a connection, but you can't really gauge much from it really. Like, it's a visual similarity, but that's about it. But it is that connection that has sent me down this rabbit hole of finding other connections between what we already know about Loki and this deity Kanunos. The only issue there is that we barely know anything about Loki, so beyond a few, albeit very interesting links I found between the two figures, it will be a lot more speculative, where I try to assign some information about this figure to Loki in a manner that it fits with what we already know. So with that, what we do know of Prince Loki is that he was born around the same time as the winter solstice, and the Giants have a huge amount of respect for him, so much so that they put aside their hatred for Big Mom in support of his love for Chiffon before all of that fell apart, and the Giants went back to hating her even more so now, and That is it. That is all we officially know about him, and I even padded the information there to make it seem like it was more. It's barely anything at all if we include the current ongoings and the idea that this giant who has self-styled themselves as the sun god is Loki. Then we have a bit more to go off of, but again, it's still not much. But it is enough, because another connection with the other guy is that we know Loki was born during the winter solstice, and so was Kanunas. So that's another interesting link, but for me it gets even more intriguing when you add to it what we know about the giants and their traditional fasting in the name of the sun or sun god during the winter solstice. In chapter 866 during Big Mom's backstory, Mother Carmel says this: the winter solstice is a festival for the death and rebirth of the sun. After a harsh winter, it will regain its strength and warmth again. And back to Kanunos, he is born on the darkest day of the year, the winter solstice, and about 6 months later, on the summer solstice, he dies. From what I've read so far, I can't really connect the rest of the information I found from Kanunos to Loki. Maybe that'll change as we learn more, but for now, let's just go off of this. Luffy is the true sun god, and Loki is the false sun god, the inverse. The winter solstice celebrates the sun's death and then rebirth, whereas Kanunos is born in the winter solstice and dies in the summer solstice, again the inverse. So with that, my thought process is that Loki will die at some point in the story, maybe during the final war, because in the context of One Piece, I interpret the summer solstice as being the same as when the dawn shines on the world, so the world's liberation, so the final war. Maybe you can link that death of Loki to the concept of Ragnarok and the death of the Norse gods, but that may be a stretch too far, especially considering Loki dies fighting against the Norse pantheon and specifically Heimdall, and I have no One Piece equivalent to Heimdall at this point in the story, so that can be ignored. I said that I wouldn't delve deeper into the mythos of Kanunos, and the reason for that is, besides not knowing too much about Prince Loki, his counterpart in this situation, is due to the small amount of information on him, reliable information. It's unclear as to how accurate, if at all accurate, the interpretations of the existing information actually is. He's been associated with animals, nature, fertility, wealth, the underworld, sacrifices of animals and people, specifically prisoners of war, that were made in his name, so it's a pretty wide spectrum that he has been spread across, so that could possibly be a reason why Oda chose him as a point of reference for Loki, due to how vague and up to interpretation his role is. I don't know. It leaves a lot of room for creativity. Take that last point about sacrifices of animals and human prisoners of war. You could say liken that to this toy playset diorama that we have just escaped from, which contains animals like the rabbit ear god or the hedgehog, as well as regular humans who, if we do follow the idea that they are prisoners of war, maybe them being in that playset is a punishment for their wrongdoings or something. I am not saying that is the case, since a lot of mental gymnastics are required to get the point across, but I'm not going to completely rule it out either, because the figure of Kanunos offers that kind of creative freedom. Although I will just say I'm 99% sure that this just isn't the case. I've just made that up completely just to help get my point across. And like I said, with the Norse mythology Loki, we aren't going to have a simple rehashed version of these figures. They'll be their own characters, or single character in this case. If I remember, I'll reference the websites I used for research in the description if you want to look into it, but that's all I've got so far. So that's all on this fake sun god giant who I still believe is Prince Loki. I mean, a diorama this big in a room this large, and a giant who is this big, maybe bigger than any other regular giant that we have seen in the story, and we know Loki from Norse mythology was an actual giant, a frost giant, a Jotun to be specific. So all of that checks out. As for his body shape, silhouettes and finalized character designs are more often very different than the same in One Piece anyway. Just look at Kaido then and now, let alone all the hints from the previous chapter. And as for where the arc goes after this, as Loki chases them, if it is Loki, then we will be traversing the real castle of the giant royalty. Loki will be chasing them through it. The only thing I will say, one other thing that is confusing me, is that we saw Luffy in Gear 5 just now, but the giant doesn't seem intrigued by it. See how Dory and Broggy reacted? I'd assume that all giants would recognize the form at least somewhat, and especially for someone who is impersonating the sun god Nika, he is chasing them in anger. Maybe because the jig is up, he's gonna be exposed. Maybe because he really cared about this miniature world he created. I'm not sure, but running through the castle will lead to either them breaking out or having to deal with the situation inside. But either way, within the next few chapters, we will get to see the double page spread when the Straw Hats step outside to reveal the true, in all of its might and glory, the true Warland Elbaf.